Ladies and gentlemen, we are live, and Halloween is right around the corner. So, what better time to, I guess you'd say, summon the spirits of magic and insanity or hallucinations than this time right now? Our guest is going to be Robert Connor, and he's written on this topic extensively. Not only is it in John Loftus' book on the case against miracles, and John Loftus in the opening of this book said, when he wrote me this, he said, to Derek, with this book, the case is closed. Now, this is all against the miracle stuff. And he has 2 chapters specifically in this book. We're going to delve into the magic Jesus and just magic in general, which I've never talked about. I don't know how I've gone this long and haven't actually discussed this topic in any detail. And then also, we're going to talk about Paul, what was going on with this guy. So with that being said, let's get our intro started, and then I'll bring our guest on. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. And today, ladies and gentlemen, I have a special guest. I've been wanting to have him on for a long time now. We finally made it happen, and that is Robert Connor. Welcome to MythVision, my friend.
Glad to be here.
I'm extremely excited because I think I wrote you, was it like a year ago on email?
It could be. Yeah. The last year has kind of just been a time warp, given COVID-19 and everything else.
Absolutely. And I thought about some of the work you've done in the past. I've listened to some of your episodes, but I actually was able to read some of the stuff you talk about here. And I want everybody to know, not only did you get a couple chapters, this is just an appetizer. This is a teaser for the work you do. And one of the books you've written, and it's just a couple years old, is Apparitions of Jesus, the Resurrection as a Ghost Story. And this book right here is a must get. Can you tease us with what this book's about before we get into something else?
Yes, basically, probably 6, 7, 8 years, 10 years, whatever it was, that I was writing one of the first books that I did on magic in the career of Jesus. I was reading a background book on Greco-Roman magic, which included witches, magic, ghost stories, and what have you. And as I was reading the ghost story section, I thought, wow, this has a lot of similarities to the resurrection appearances. And I'm thinking, no, come on. And then the more I looked at it and went back and noticed more similarities, I thought, well, okay, let's look at something, start with something that we're sure about. We're sure that the gospel writers, whoever they were, went back into the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and they picked up not only verses that they interpreted as prophetic, but they even picked up stories, themes, storylines. So if they borrowed from that section of the culture with which they were familiar, and these are guys writing in Greek, okay, so they're obviously familiar with Greco-Roman culture. That's the broader culture they're living in. And they're trying to describe somebody who came back from the dead. What do we call people who come back from the dead? Ghosts. spirits, whatever. And if you begin cataloging these appearances, these apparitions, as I choose to call them, what are some of the characteristics? Well, Jesus in John walks through a door that's locked and appears and then says something, teaching, warning, admonishing, which is what ghosts do in classic ghost stories. You know, even in modern ghost stories, they come back and say, the will, it's in the second drawer on the left, you know. And this is, I mean, that's what they do. They're Lucian has a story. Lucian is a writer from about the 2nd century or thereabouts, has a great story about a woman who has been cremated, and a lot of her belongings have been cremated with her so that they will go up to the spirit realm. But her husband forgot a slipper, one of her favorites. He only put one on there, and she comes back to remind him about the other one. So,
jeez, that was a
yeah,
badass slipper.
yeah,
Everyone wishes they had that slipper. If you're
yeah.
coming back to tell them about a slipper, that's a
And
slipper.
then in Luke, the Road to Emmaus story that everybody is familiar with, that's the longest story in the Gospels about Jesus coming back. He sits down with them to eat the evening meal. He breaks the bread, which is a Eucharistic reference.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly he disappears, which is what ghosts do. They disappear suddenly. They walk through doors, they disappear suddenly, they appear out of nowhere, they admonish people or warn people or tell people stuff that they would have told them had they been alive. Yeah.
Yeah, this is...
And here's the response of people when Jesus comes back. If you look through the Gospels and you read these accounts closely, fear and confusion. They're not all, oh, wow, it's Jesus. Hey, dude, you're back. They are,
doubt.
yes, they doubt. And they are fearful and they don't know quite how to process it. And that's typical of the way people react to ghosts. So if you start ticking down through all the similarities, you know, then it finally builds up to a point where you have to ask yourself, now, wait a minute, can this all be coincidental? You know, and the more you look into it, the whole background of ghost lore, there are other issues in this which we could touch on about the manner of ghost which is most likely to come back. Because not all ghosts or not all dead people were considered equally likely to return as a ghost, but there were some who were considered very likely to become a ghost, particularly people who died violently. And
so this is a superstition in the
yes,
milieu of the world they lived in. Okay,
yes, very much.
I want our audience to know who you are, and maybe I should have started with that because I know who you are, and I'm over here excited because I don't think they know who you are, and I think it'd be important for them to know the caliber of work you've done. You're not a PhD,
No.
but you have done extensive work on Jesus the Magician. You know, you've looked at this older material. You have shown not only the issues with Paul we're going to get into, but the whole, what kind of world did they live in? They lived in this magical world. So before we do, I've got some super chats I want to touch, and then we can get deep dive into this material. Is that all right?
Yeah. I mean, when I was a young man, I was involved with a Christian sect that was always talking about, you know, the end of the world, Armageddon. It could happen anytime, the signs of the end, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And somewhere along the edges, you know, that belief had begun to peel up.
Right.
But it was common and still is common among religious fundamentalist groups that they use what I call the original Greek move. They always play the original Greek card. Well, if you don't understand this, son, it's because you can't see into the original Greek. In the original Greek, blah, 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 we know, so on. Now, it should probably go without saying that people who make this argument are, even if they understand enough Greek to read the Greek New Testament, in a broader sense, they are frequently linguistically illiterate. So I decided, okay, you know what? Let's give it a shot. So I enrolled in a state university and I started taking Greek. And then I thought, well, oh yeah, I'll take some Hebrew. And then over a summer session, I took, some Aramaic, which was kind of wasted. And then did an independent study in Coptic with one of the professors.
Oh my gosh. I've heard that's a headache of a language, by the way.
That is so far removed from the Indo-European language pattern that it will make your head swim. Yeah. It's like it takes all of the rules and it just reshuffles them completely.
So real quick, Robert, let me read these off real quick. I've got these super chats. I'll pull them up on the screen and read them. Mr. Monster, thank you for the 5, my friend. Paul and Muhammad seem similar in the sense that they both had a stroke and hallucinated a divine figure and started a religion from it after that. Now, we're going to get into this. I really do appreciate your super chat. So we're going to be talking about Paul deeply in this conversation. Mm-hmm. Troy Miller, thank you for the super chat. Paying my tithes, but not my offerings. It would be too Christian to give both. Thank you, Troy. I appreciate the love. I seriously do. And last one is Gamer with Options says you can look up Homer and the ghost scenes he describes there are a few. The similarities are cute.
Yeah. Yes.
And last of all, we got one more that popped up. Sorry. Does Robert know about Barakat 6A6? I don't know. Do you know anything about that?
That doesn't ring a bell. Yeah, right offhand. I didn't really get into the Hebrew part of it. I got into the grammar and did very well with the grammar, but I frankly was not all that terribly interested in the Old Testament.
Right.
And I just kind of let it lapse to the point where, at this point, I probably couldn't get you through the Hebrew alphabet anymore, to be completely honest.
No, I get it. Like if you tried to ask me any calculus, I could have done that in high school. Right now, I'd have a hard time with long form division. I couldn't I used to know all this. So, okay. Stay tuned. If you're watching this now, trust me, you do not want to miss this. I swear. Like, I don't usually do this. I don't usually tell you this. I'll say stuff like, oh, this is a great episode. And sometimes I don't know how to translate that to you on how much this is an important episode. Not only is it October and we're right here at Halloween and talking about spirits and devils and demons and people who are hallucinating and all that, but this has been a long time coming. So, Robert, let's start with Jesus and magic in the ancient world. Can you somehow paint a picture? Because I know thousands of pages could be written on this and we wouldn't even have scratched the surface of the iceberg. So,
right. Jesus is the gospel Jesus. Okay. Let me make a distinction here that really is a difference. As most of your listeners are probably aware, there is a movement, has been a movement for at least a century or more that has concentrated on the historical Jesus. And that came around because mainstream Bible scholars, not the literalist fringe, but people in the mainstream analyzed the Gospels, and it kind of dawned on them, these don't sound like eyewitnesses. This doesn't look like eyewitness testimony because Mark and Matthew basically take Luke and Matthew basically take all of Mark and just keep reworking it. And it's not original stuff. They add and they tweak. So the question is there a historical character behind these stories? And if so, how would we identify him? Then the next thing is to look at gospel Jesus, which is to some extent a mythological Jesus. And that's fairly easy to demonstrate.
I think everyone, historicist and mythicist, all agree the
Yeah.
Gospels, no matter what. I mean, mythicists obviously, but even historicists don't play
Yes.
around.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there, I have distinguished between what I call hard mythicism, which is, in other words, Jesus is simply a confection. He's a made up character, and soft mythicism, which is the typical position of a mainstream New Testament scholar who looks at this and says, well, yeah, we know this didn't really, probably didn't happen, and these words were put in Jesus' mouth, and or maybe Jesus would never have said something like this if he was a practicing Jew, blah, 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 blah. So but there's never quite an agreement or consensus upon where the mythicism ends, where the historicism starts, etc. Right. It's very confusing. It's very murky. So anyway, what we have in the Gospels, Gospel Jesus is participating basically in the mythology and the folklore of his day, because that's basically what it is. For example, when Jesus in Luke 11 talks about a person having an exorcism and the evil spirit goes out, and then the evil spirit goes into a waterless place and he finds 7 spirits more evil than himself, and then they come back and they take the person over again. And then his condition is worse than when he started.
Right.
Well, the 7 spirit thing, 7 is, if you have read any of the magical papyri, which were discovered and cataloged, well, discovered over a period of a century or more, but really cataloged in Germany in the 20s and 30s, 7 is a favorite magical number.
Right.
And if you remember Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 spirits were expelled, 777. Or Revelation, the 7 lamps, the 7, the 7 churches, the 7-headed wild beast, the 7 this, 7 that.
Right.
In other words, it's telling you that on one level, gospel Jesus is completely immersed and participating in this culture, because why would he not? How could he not be participating? You can't just step outside of a cultural condition. And then we have in John, here's something that would escape your notice, no matter how many times you read the Gospel of John. There are 7 signs in the Gospel of John.
7 miracles, right.
7 miracles.
And the last is the resurrection of Lazarus.
Yeah. Yes. And then there are 7 I am sayings. And of course, in the Hebrew tradition, I am is basically one of the names of God. So there's 7 of them. And then in the gospel, there are 7 witnesses who say that Jesus is the Son of God. So you've got these 7s buried in there, and you'd have to be a rather close reader to realize and start counting them and say, oh, but of course, what other number would it be? And then we get into early Christianity. I mean, early Christianity is full of this. In Acts 5, it talks about Peter's shadow healing people. People bring the sick out in their cots and lay them in the street. And as Peter walks by, as his shadow falls on them, they're healed. So it's like his shadow is an extension of him, like his hand. Like, I don't have to touch you, just my shadow will heal you.
Now, I want to say, just because people who haven't read your chapter, this is mentioned in the chapter in the Loftus, the case of miracles.
Yeah.
For those who are just now tuning in, because we're just now past 207 people watching live. And I want everyone to know a lot of the details he's talking about is in this book, but far more detail goes into his own personal works. And one of the things you mentioned in this is this whole notion, like if I was, and I've done this, I've read this, now that I've been reading this as someone who believes that, no, I don't believe this is literally true, what's going on? I would have read that shadow thing and just been like, it's just all they're doing is just making a story up, right? But here's the thing. In the magic tradition that you're talking about, like actual people who are practicing magic, right? And we like to think that Christians weren't, right? We like to think, oh, no, this is Christianity. This is true.
Right.
And that all that other stuff is magic, and that's not true. We don't know that there's shadow type of magic from other magical traditions that aren't what we call Christian, and they had these shadow type healings and things and handkerchiefs and clothing items. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. In the magical texts, in the Greek magical papyri that were gathered together by praise and dance, there is a character or a type of thing called a paradros. And the paradros is basically a helper. And the helper could be any number of things. The helper could be a spirit. It could be what we would call an angel. It could be a god. It could be a ghost. In fact, there are quite a number of spells where the ghosts of people who died young or people who were violently killed are summoned back by the magician to be a paradros, a helper. And interestingly enough, these are fragmentary documents that have been gathered. Most of these papyrus documents, many of them, were actually found in garbage dumps where they had survived for centuries and centuries because it was so dry, nothing rotted. And it took scholars a long time to sort through this material and begin translating it. So that's why it was around for quite a long time before anybody thought, why don't we find out what these people really believed? This is our window into that. Interestingly, one of these spells is for a shadow, to make your shadow your servant, as if it wasn't going to follow you around anyway. And
you're in the desert, right? So you're constantly seeing a shadow, but this is really it's interesting superstition to peer into the mind of people.
Yeah. And then the other thing that comes from the Greek magical papyri in particular are what we would call talismans, relics, if you will. In Acts 14, for example, Paul was a tent maker and he wore aprons, and it turns out in Acts 14, whether it was actually true or not, because the writer of Acts apparently did never meet Paul. He never met him, didn't know him. But anyway, the story in there is that Paul's aprons and the clothing that touched his skin could be applied to people and they would be healed of sickness. And that's typical, the Catholic relic, basically, is as a survival of that magical idea that objects that come in contact with you, if you are powerful, carry that power. It's sort of like magical contamination. So any place that a holy person touched, it becomes a shrine, right? It becomes powerful simply by association with a saint or with Jesus. How many pieces of the true cross are there out there? In cathedrals and what have you.
Places of Jesus, or how many places was he killed at, or there's so many. I do want to make mention for those who may not have heard this before, but Christians were doing magic, and it wasn't called technically this by themselves. So if you considered something orthodoxy, everyone else is heresy that isn't within it. So you're not going to hear them belittle their own position. It is their position that is true. Everyone else is wrong.
Yes.
So how do we look in the mirror in that and peer and see, okay, this is what you're doing. You're saying, okay, there's shadow work going on. There's clothing items, handkerchiefs, the Eucharist. Oh, that's a whole nother one that I know you're going to get into. But all of these are clear evidences of magical practices. We also have internal evidence to suggest, if you take it historical, accusations even towards Jesus himself in Gospels of suggesting you have power over Beelzebub and things like this. That is a magical thing.
Yes. Yeah, and this is, I mean, we could go into the details of this for, I don't know, 15 classroom periods to break all of these down individually and analyze them and compare them cross-culturally to other stuff that's going on. But the thing about miracle, the thing about magic is this is how Christianity spread. We don't have to wonder about that. We're told specifically. Remember, Jesus tells people of his day, unless you see signs and wonders, you will never believe. We're talking about a world in which at least 90% of the people were illiterate. And literacy then was a city kind of thing. You had to be an administrator or in charge of something to even need literacy. So when Jesus is going around through these rural villages, what's getting the message out? Miracles. What else would work? People crowd around Jesus. They bring people out to, there's a story in, I think it's Mark, where they break a hole in the ceiling and they drop a person down on a cot so Jesus can heal him because they can't otherwise get him, close enough to Jesus to touch him. And then his name begins to spread. And then finally in Mark, we are told that the disciples see somebody using Jesus' name to heal somebody or to cast out demons.
Yeah.
And they tell him, no, you can't do that. You're not one of us. But he's using Jesus' name professionally as an exorcist.
Yeah.
As a business. And this is something.
Reader. I'm just kidding.
But this tells you something about what names were in this culture. The name was not something that just identified you. The name actually carried your power. And that's a hard idea initially.
Christians say it all the time. There's no name in heaven and earth and
yes.
Jesus, but they don't even realize the magical underlying of the culture that they're actually going into when they say that. I know that because I used to say this.
Yeah,
there's power in the name of Jesus, power in the blood of Jesus.
Names to us, to our culture, names represent, and they could be anything. My name could be John or Robert or whatever, and it wouldn't matter. But in the ancient world, the name doesn't represent. The name actually carries the entity's power, which is why, for example, in Acts, we have all these miracles that are done. How? In the name of Jesus. Specifically, occasionally they will say, in the name of Jesus crucified, because the crucifixion adds power to that name, because that's a violent death.
That's right.
And that infuses more power. It's not just an ordinary death. Somebody didn't just die of old age in their house. So how about Matthew 7? Did we not prophesy in your name and drive out demons in your name and in your name perform many powerful works? And then what does Jesus tell them? Get away from me. I never knew you. You're workers of lawlessness. So these workers of lawlessness can prophesy and they can drive out demons and they can do all these powerful works, not because they're, partnering with Jesus specifically, or they're even recognized by Jesus. It's simply, they know his name, just like this exorcist who's making the rounds and casting out demons in Jesus' name. And then, of course, we have this really amusing situation in Acts where this high priest, the son of the high priest named Sceva, there was never a high priest named Sceva, is casting out devils. How many devils? 7, of course. 7.
Yeah.
There it is again. And the devil says, no, I take it back. I'm screwing this story up. It's 7 priests, sons of Sceva, who are casting out one demon. And the demon turns on them and begins attacking them, and the 7 exorcists run out of the house, So it's the demon expels the seven exorcists instead of the exorcist expelling seven demons.
Right.
So the writer of Acts knows that his readers are so familiar with this formula that he can turn it on its head and basically make fun of these people who are using Jesus' name and Paul's name to exorcise, even though they don't believe in Jesus and they don't believe what Paul believes.
Mm.
But I can spin this around and turn it into comedy, basically. And as you look at that, you're thinking, wow. But you have to understand that culture, and you have to understand their beliefs. And that's the hardest part. It's hard to make that jump. And that's one of the things that I start off actually this book on the apparitions of Jesus, talking about who these ghosts were in Greco-Roman culture and what these people believed, how seriously did these people take ghosts. And they had their equivalent of Halloween when the dead came back and visited homes and were thought to come back to their familiar haunts, so to speak. And they had specific procedures for getting rid of them, to clear the house of these ghosts. And it goes on and on. I mean, the Greco-Romans had not one but three gods of doorways, simply because ghosts hung around doors. So they had a door, the god of the threshold, a god of the door, and even a god of the hinges.
Is this why Jews even today have the little
Yes.
What is it called? Is the Shema inside of
mezuzah? Is it
mezuzah? I can't remember, but they kiss
I
it
can't,
on the way
yeah.
in,
Yes.
every day to the door. So, and also makes me wonder about blood magic, because blood magic paints on the door, so the spirit of death cannot come in. There's a lot of interesting potential parallels here.
People used to hang horseshoe over the door.
This is interesting because it's peering into that mindset.
Yeah.
So something to ask before we get into the Eucharist, just briefly to talk about that. I'd love to get your insights on one comment and then one thing to ask. Matthew 7. A lot of people even think this is a jab at Paul. Some people think that this is an anti-Pauline rhetoric in Matthew 7, that Paul's the one who's out here working all these things, and the other guys are going, no. So this pro-Jewish gospel, Matthew, is being written to kind of jab at Paul. Could be what you said. It doesn't matter. Either way makes sense. The other thing, though, is the question I'd like to ask someone who's a naturalist like me, who's looking at this going, how do we explain this activity? Is it like what we're seeing with Benny Hinn's and these street preachers in these third world countries in Africa, where they're pretending to, oh, look, the leg, it's straight, the leg, or the arm straight now. Oh, did you see the miracle? Is it something like that? What is your opinion on that?
You said it, bro. I didn't, but
I mean, I'd like to know. I'm interested.
You know, there's I have concluded after looking at questions like this over a long period of time that about 40% of the human race is just basically they believe what they believe. They believe in belief. And if you have to maybe process that, but they believe that if they believe, it is true. Their belief makes it so. And I think that is a human characteristic, and I think that has been around for millennia, probably since modern humans emerged, whatever, 200,000 years ago or something, that it's a characteristic of the human mind. If I believe it, it must be true, because otherwise, why would I not believe it?
Yeah.
It's not only circular, it's like this little hard nucleus of thought that just doesn't go away, and it's not dispelled by explanation or education. It's just a characteristic of the mind, which is stronger in some people than in others. So you could call 40% of the human race functionally insane. if you wanted to. I mean, they believe what they believe, and you've known these people. I know you've
I
talked to
was
these.
one.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
you've talked to these people, and it bounces off of them like water off a duck. It's like
Cognitive dissonance, but it's also
yeah,
inherent. I think there's like this inherent superstitious thing that we
yes,
carry this agency in so many things. So this is why I think polytheism is so, it predates monotheism and such. Real quick, I want to let everyone know in the chat, you don't have to debate over whether or not I'm part of an occult. I get paid every Friday from the Illuminati. So, and it's big bucks. You don't
I
have
knew
to
it.
worry.
I knew it.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
knew
We
it.
didn't talk about that, but someone else was talking about it. They said I'm part of some type of order in the cult.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That's easy. Look, what do you guys don't have to debate about that. You already knew this. You knew this.
Exactly.
My eye symbol.
Exactly.
Don't you guys know the eye? Duh, the all
Yeah.
seeing eye.
Yeah.
This is common sense. I don't even know why they're arguing about this in the chat right now, ladies and gentlemen.
I think you're part of the deep state, personally.
I'm not
pretty
gonna
sure.
lie. When I started this channel, I was more into the Miguel Connor type of stuff. Like I was still theistic somewhat. And I was like, yeah, there's esoterics out there. Let me investigate. Of course, that path personally led me into realizing, okay, these are superstitions,
Right.
and these are just old ways we humans thought and created religions. But maybe I'm just saying that so that I keep getting my paycheck from the Illuminati. I don't know. You make the guess. No,
well, before we jump off this, let me make one other point
please.
that your people may find interesting. Okay. Who's heard of the evil eye? Pretty much everybody, especially if you're Italian. Okay. You know, the malocchio. Okay. I'm looking at you. Jesus believed in it. In Matthew 6 and in Luke 11, he talks about the ophthalmos poneros, the evil eye. Yeah, and there was a verb and some other vocabulary associated with that. The idea that you could be bewitched by someone with the evil eye is common all over the Mediterranean, has been for centuries and centuries. Galatians 3, Paul opens the chapter by saying, who has bewitched you?
Yeah, that term in Greek that you put in.
Yes. So
who has cast a spell on you?
Who has cast a spell on you? And the process was called baskania, was the spell casting. And the person who did that was a baskanos, which was a black magician, essentially, who could cast a spell on you by a malicious eye. Now think about who Paul was talking about in this context. He's talking about other Christians.
Mm-hmm.
So basically the short answer to Paul's question, who has bewitched you, is other Christians.
Oh, man.
So he's accusing competing preachers of being black magicians.
Okay, I gotta read something you actually put. Now, you added the term crackerjack, and I didn't know where that came from. What is the context on that, if you don't mind?
Well, the crackerjack apostles, Paul is writing about these apostles in Jerusalem, these notable figures.
Yeah.
And I decided to call them crackerjack apostles. As some people translate that, super apostles. Because what he's basically saying is, and this is, we'll get into this when we talk about Paul,
right,
is that these people may have, trekked around with Jesus, and they may have known him personally, and they might even be related to him, but they're nothing to me. Yeah, these so-called super crackerjack apostles. And crackerjack is kind of a redneck hillbilly, expression.
Yeah, the so-called pillars, as DJ Frank says here.
Yes, the so-called pillars. Yeah.
I got to read this part you put in here. So first things first, in the book, The Case Against Miracles, which means I'm working against the Illuminati. What the hell?
Uh,
Anyway,
it's confusing.
it
It's
is so
confusing.
my paycheck's confusing too. It's hard. It like shows numbers and then I don't really actually receive any money. It's weird.
Maybe it's Bitcoin or something.
Yeah. So on page 466 of this book, if you don't have it, this is ending of the chapter of Magic Jesus. He says the conclusion is incontrovertible. To enter into the world of Jesus and primitive Christianity is to enter fully into the world of magic. You can't understand it if you don't. I'm telling you, there's no way. And that's what really blew my mind about you. And then the last quote I want to read from this chapter that you wrote is pertaining to Paul. And you were created. Oh, hold on. Nope. That's in the chapter about Paul that actually I think I get into. So yeah, I'm already skipping and jumping the horse into the quote that we find. Is it in? Did you give the reference? You just talk about him attacking his opponents. I guess I could read it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll get everybody up to speed here. If only you would allow me, this is on page 519 of A Case Against Miracles by John Loftus and, of course, all the authors in it. If only you would allow me some small folly, and there's a Greek word, I do not regard myself as inferior to the crackerjack apostles. For if I am ordinary in speech and I am not inferior in knowledge, as is clearly apparent to you in every way, for men like that are false apostles, dishonest workers, masquerading as apostles of Christ, and no wonder for Satan transforms himself into an angel of light. It is no great thing, therefore, if his servants disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Again, I say, let no one think of me of unsound mind. But if so, bear with me, so I may brag about myself a little. Even if I am inclined to brag, I will not be a fool. Aphron, is that how you say it?
Yes.
Because I will be speaking the truth, but I refrain lest anyone think more of me than justified by what he sees in me or what he hears from me, and on account of the transcendence of my revelations. I have become a fool, Aphron. You compelled me. I ought to have been esteemed by you. I was not inferior to the crackerjack apostles, even if I am nothing. To the contrary, I constantly perform the signs of an apostle in your midst, signs and wonders and powerful works. Anyway, I just thought about that there's this contention. They're competing magical Christian movements going on already.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, here's the thing. It's a little mind-blowing. Or actually, it's pretty mind-blowing. Paul's letters, there are 7 of them that are generally regarded as genuine letters, and the others as either misattributed or more likely just forgeries. But the letter in Galatians, if you're going to read a book in the New Testament, read the letter to the Galatians and think about it. Think about what this guy's saying, because it's really bizarre. Paul is basically saying that, first of all, in Galatians, he specifies he did not get his gospel from men.
Right.
He was not taught his gospel. He got it through revelation, a series of revelations, where Paul is presumably hearing Jesus and maybe seeing Jesus speaking to him. If that were your next door neighbor, what would your conclusion be? Kind of right off the bat. It's like, okay.
Yes. You wouldn't have to guess it.
Yes. I see you around, buddy. It was great talking to you.
Yeah.
Later. Then Paul, I mean, it gets better and better and better in Galatians. He tells the people that he's writing to that when he converted, he didn't go up to Jerusalem. He didn't go and search out Jesus' brothers, and he didn't find the other disciples and apostles. He took off for Arabia. He spent some time in Arabia because that's what, as one does when you undergo a deep religious conversion and the relatives of the person you converted to are still alive, you ignore them. Then, after years, in response to a vision, naturally. He finally goes up to Jerusalem and he spends some time with the Apostle Peter and Jesus' brother James. He tells his congregations in this letter that it added nothing to his preaching.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't change his message. So meeting Jesus' brother and, on this rock I will build my church, yada, yada, meant nothing. He just blows that off. And I'm thinking, okay, wow, that's interesting, to
Right.
say the least, right? I mean, what are the odds that a normal, rational person would do that and have no change of opinion or didn't change anything? The other thing about Paul, which is just mind blowing if you think about it, is Paul has no interest in gospel Jesus. He doesn't mention a single one of Jesus' miracles. He doesn't mention that Jesus publicly raised people from the dead. Walked on water. Did all kinds of stuff like this. Multiplied food. But you would think the raising people from the dead, you would think somebody would have something to say about that. He doesn't specifically quote any of Jesus' teaching. He doesn't go into, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, blah, 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 blah. He's not interested in that. In fact, Paul doesn't get interested in Jesus until Jesus dies and is raised. And he tells here's how you see the progression of theology in the New Testament. Paul, who is the first Christian writer of whom we have any surviving record, he's writing now 30 years before the first gospel is written. Paul tells us that Jesus was declared the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. When is he declared the Son of God in Mark? When he's baptized. The dove comes down, the heavens open up, the voice says, "This is my beloved Son."
Mm-hmm.
In Luke, when do we hear that Jesus is the Son of God?
In the belly, in his mom.
Yeah, in his mommy. He's already the Son of God in his mommy. And then in John,
before the world was created.
Yeah, in John, he's moved all the way back to deep time. Right. He's right there in the beginning with God. So right. Jesus is being progressively divinized in the New Testament, which is technically it's called apotheosis. It's like, we have to divinize you. Why do we have to divinize Jesus? Well, because Jesus didn't come back as expected, which is another chapter in there that I wrote that is kind of the big flywheel of the early Christian economy, is that Jesus is going to be back. He's going to be back so soon. Paul tells people in 1 Corinthians, you shouldn't even get married.
Yeah.
Don't even bother. Which is kind of interesting because you know how Christians are always using that passage from 1 Corinthians 13 about love in their wedding ceremony.
They're not quoting that one while they're at a wedding.
No, it's like the actual Paul said, "Hey, don't get married. That's a big mistake." Jesus is going to be here any minute. He'll be here anytime, and you don't want to be distracted.
Right. Oh, man.
But it's irony, and they don't get that, No.
Yeah. Absolutely. Real quick, guys, super chat here. Jake Outrider, thank you for the super chat. Matthew was written after Mark and Paul. Makes sense that the rock Peter, quote, was added by anti-Paulinist. Further evidence of Mark priority. Interesting.
Yeah, I think there's clearly combat going here. If you read Paul's letters, when he does finally go up to Jerusalem, he negotiates an understanding with the poor, he calls them, in Jerusalem. And there was an early Christian sect, scholars call them the Ebionites, which basically means poor. So basically, it sounds like, if you read between the lines a little bit, that Paul went to Jerusalem and said, "What's it going to take? You know, how much money do I need to collect for the poor in Jerusalem? And then I will go and I'll get out of your hair, and we'll just go our separate ways." Then along comes the Jewish-Roman War, when the Romans finally get tired of rebellion in this province, and they invade Galilee, and then they keep moving further south until they finally destroy the city of Jerusalem itself. And then they move down a little further, and they finally conquer that last stronghold in Masada that a lot of people have heard about. Well, that kind of wipes out that community of early believers, because there were, some people estimate, like 1 million people died in this process. And everybody's heard of the Roman Colosseum. Well, apparently that was built with slave labor. And a lot of the slave labor that came into building the Flavian Colosseum were people that were taken captive in the Middle East. So, yeah. So these people are scattered and basically gone by AD 70 for sure. And then the first gospel, Mark, comes along, and it's written somewhere, we don't know, by who, we don't really know, around 70-ish.
Yeah, I like to think late 70s, just because it's right after Josephus's first writing this major work. But also, what I found interesting, you were talking about Paul, when he had this agreement in Galatians, then all of a sudden he goes off to his mission, and what do we see in his own letters? What sounds to me is the very poor. There are people from this Jerusalem community that are going out to these churches trying to combat what Paul's doing, and he's having to make excuses to them. Listen, I am one of them too. What do you listen to me?
Yeah.
Don't listen to them.
Yeah.
Like, why is he competing if there was this agreement?
Yes.
You know, something had to happen, it sounds. And James Tabor, you know, he lives about 2 hours from me. He says, yeah, I think there was definitely a split in the original community.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
But I mean, this whole, like, I love seeing this whole thing about Paul. What we didn't say so far, and the title of this video did, is that we're suggesting Paul's hallucinating. Paul is I guess you could say crazy, and I don't mean it in derogatory sense.
He is crazy. Paul doesn't need anything, you know, from the original Jesus people, because he's getting it by revelation. And it's not just regular revelations. These are astounding revelations where he goes up to the third heaven and he doesn't know whether he's in or out of his body, and da-da-da-da. And in this chapter that you've referenced, I go through a lot of the fairly recent literature on the difference between, well, insanity and religion. And most of the people, this first book that I ran across that examined this in detail was written back in about 2001. And the contributors to this conclude that there really isn't any way to distinguish between visions and hallucinations. There's no set of rules. There are no guidelines here to tell when somebody would be having a vision and somebody was just out of their mind. And when you look at Paul's letter, and especially that section that you read, where he keeps referring to himself as a fool, as an apron, in other words, mindless, bananas, whatever you want to
saying, I am
call
not.
it.
He's defending himself too.
He's got to be defending himself against somebody
who's accusing him of being
exactly
insane.
Yeah, I mean, why would he go into this spiel about this unless it had become an issue? Why would you bring it up? Not a good look. You know.
Yeah, you open that chapter really interesting. You say, generally speaking, is a great way to open. I wouldn't advocate psychoanalyzing figures from the remote past. Those sufficiently motivated to write their stories were often motivated to glorify or vilify their subjects as well. So the accounts must be read with caution. That said, and this is an interesting point you bring up, given the self-revelation in his letters, Paul of Tarsus has proven an inviting target for armchair psychoanalysis. Without gratuitously speculating about the mental state of person none of us ever met, it's worth looking at what Paul said about himself. So you actually start getting into like what he said about himself.
Yeah.
You quote that whole paragraph, and then I underlined, I started putting real underlining on some stuff here where you said, historical accuracy aside, based on the accounts in Acts, all right, several authors have suggested that Paul's conversion experience resulted from an epileptic seizure, and a review of the literature shows that the connections between religious sentiment, sudden religious conversion, and epilepsy have been recognized for at least 2 centuries, particularly William James in his landmark, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And you just go on to talk about eclectic seizures, and holy men were oftentimes the ones who had these experiences most often because they were the closest to the divine. So if you had a mental health issue, it makes me wonder too, when Paul says his thorn in the flesh, I wonder what that has to do with. If that's, we don't really know, but it makes me wonder if it plays some part in this.
Yeah, it's like endless speculation on what the thorn in the flesh is. But you just go through Paul's letters, for example, in 2 Corinthians, let no one regard me as of unsound mind. Why would you say that unless somebody regarded you as of unsound mind? How about 2 Corinthians 11? I speak like a deranged man. And he's using he's using a form of the Greek word paraphranesis, which basically means delirium, madness. So he's recognizing that, yes, apparently somebody thought you were talking like you were, lost it.
Yeah.
Then in Galatians 6, he tells the people he has the stigmata of Jesus. Now, we know what, if you're a Catholic, you know what stigmata are. It's the signs of the cross, the crucifixion that appears on the saint. Paul was the first to claim that, he has the stigmata of Jesus, whatever that meant to him. I don't know. We have no way of knowing. But apparently, he had identified so closely with his concept of Jesus that, and he talks about, if you've been crucified, to the world, you're dead to the world, blah, blah, blah. So maybe he just meant it figuratively, but it's an interesting concept to come up with, I would say.
Absolutely. One of the interesting things you keep pointing out is this whole magic thing in light of this. So you have a guy, let me just give an analogy. I used to be part of a non-denominational church. We spoke in tongues. Okay. We did all of the things you see, like, I think that the speaking in tongues has a connection to the Greek world as well, with this whole
absolutely,
Sibylline oracle, all of that.
Yes.
There's a connection there. But if you've ever been in a Pentecostal church and saw how batshit crazy we can get, right? And then you talk to them right after church, right? They seem perfectly normal when you talk to them, and they go to eat Burger King after church or whatever. They seem like normal individuals, but they're like tapping into insanity while they're at church, like going into this like the trance and shaking. And trust me, I've been there. I used to do this crap. Okay, I'm telling on myself, but I say that to say, like, this guy who's having visions makes you kind of wonder: is there a step further? Is this guy tripping? Is there something wired wrong here?
Well, literally in the wiring. Yeah, it's not a bug; it's a feature, kind of thing. There has been some speculation that some people are able to auto-trigger a temporal lobe seizure, and they know how to do it, and they find it pleasurable. And a lot of people who have, mentally ill, who have heard voices and what have you, don't want to stop hearing the voices, They find the voices comforting. They really believe that there's somebody got their back, guardian angel, God, whatever. Yeah, the whole thing about Paul's conversion is also weird because Paul never mentions his conversion in his letters, which
Right.
is kind of odd because you would think, if you'd been struck blind for 3 days and you heard Jesus and you saw a bright light and all that, that would be something that you would kind of work into that.
Yeah.
It's described in Acts 9 and chapter 22 and again in chapter 26. In each case, the details of the description are a little contradictory. So they're kind of, as people have said, Acts is not really historical. It's basically just pious fiction.
Right.
So whether it's based on anything real, we have no way of knowing. But if we take that at face value, Paul sees a bright light. Paul falls down. Paul is blind for 3 days. Paul has a deep religious conversion experience. All of these things have been correlated with epilepsy, specifically temporal lobe epilepsy. There is even a syndrome called Todd paralysis that follows some epileptic events where the person is temporarily paralyzed on one side, or perhaps can't move a limb or something. And blindness following an epileptic seizure. Temporary blindness is also well known. Fortunately, it's not very common, but it is well documented. If the seizure involves parts of the occipital lobe, the visual cortex, then it can be so deranged that your vision temporarily shorts out, so to speak, and doesn't come back for a while. So
yeah, I can imagine a guy like Paul, and we're going off the fictional historical, I like to call it historical fiction acts, but if Paul's running around from synagogue to synagogue and getting beat, okay, and he still comes back for more, either he's into BDSM, okay, or I'm being funny, or there's something wrong that he has to keep coming back. And I don't know if you guys seen those apologists online, right? And I'm not going to name any because I'm not trying to be derogatory here, but I do want you to kind of imagine they come into my chat, it's happened, and they just never stop, never, and they don't get the, like, we're not like what you're selling. Nobody here is buying.
Right.
We've been saying go because you're really wasting your time. And they have to, like, there's something about them having to come back. And I think Paul would have been that kind of guy who just wouldn't have gave up. And no wonder he got beheaded. I mean, you got a guy who, if he was beheaded, I'm speculating that historical account's true. This guy got martyred. And it wasn't because it's so true, but it's like the apologist in my chat online who cannot shut up about the same thing. And it's like, there's something wrong here if you feel like you are obligated to only do that. It's
compulsive. Yeah, it's compulsive behavior. You can't hear no.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't be told sit down, shut up. Yeah, you can't live with it. You've got to keep coming back. And I think part of it is that it's kind of, I've called it like a faith workout. It's like you go to the gym. It's like you go to the gym and you lift, no pain, no gain kind of thing. Yeah. And then you did your faith workout because you confronted somebody that you disagree with and you just reiterated again and again. You did so many reps and now you can go home. And that's, to me, it means nothing. It makes you feel better. It helps you, the way you look, and it blows off some steam, and that's all there really is to it, because you don't have any hope of converting that person, really. Well, maybe you do,
Maybe in your delusion you think that you're convincing somebody. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. But the weird thing is that not only in Paul's letters do we have some, if reading in between the lines, that Paul is defending himself against accusations of mental instability. We also have that interesting thing, where it is in Acts 26, where he appears before Festus, speaking of, what happens to him with the authorities. And Festus tells Paul, your many scriptures are driving you insane. And a lot of translations, some of them actually render that many scriptures, that polygrammata in Greek, as your great learning. I was like, no, it's not great learning. It's his scriptures, because 2 verses ahead of that, it tells you in the context that Paul keeps citing the prophets and Moses.
Right.
And he's rummaging around in these texts, and he's finding stuff that triggers him, so to speak, that inspires him, if you will.
Yeah, the author of Acts is making it look like this is good, but it's is this really good?
And he keeps regurgitating it until Festus is going like, dude, dude, you're over Bibled, okay?
Yeah.
Put that book down for a while.
Wow.
So even a pagan understood that back at the time. But here's the other thing, that Paul invents things. Let me see where I found this. Oh, yes. 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul is talking about Jesus' resurrection, that famous passage. And it says, Jesus was buried and raised according to these scriptures. There are no scriptures that talk about a Messiah. A Jewish Messiah comes to rescue the Jews and gets nailed to a cross by Gentiles?
Yeah.
No.
No, they were supposed to be ruled with an iron rod.
Like Superman doesn't come and get killed by a krypton bullet or, kryptonite bullet or whatever. Yeah.
He's not supposed to, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's not the story.
Right.
The story of the Messiah in the Hebrew scriptures is that the Messiah comes, kicks ass, and takes names. Yeah, that's what the Messiah does. He doesn't get killed by a bunch of Gentiles. And he certainly doesn't rise from the dead on the 3rd day.
Right.
There's absolutely nothing in the Hebrew scriptures that talks about anybody rising from the dead on the 3rd day. But Paul thinks there is.
Yeah, they're plucking out of context lots of things.
Yeah.
Hosea talks about this. I think it's Amos or Hosea. It talks about, and you'll rise from the dead, or it'll rise in the 3rd day. And it's this idea, kind of like Jonah coming back after 3 days from the belly of the well. It's that motif, but yeah.
There is a, let me see if I can find this, because it's really, really, really good. Okay. Robert J. Miller, in this book that you've referred to, has a chapter in here, chapter 9, How New Testament Writers Help Jesus Fulfill Prophecy, which I have to recommend. Dr. Miller does a beautiful job,
really,
of contextualizing these prophecies where they're yanked out of context. The vocabulary and text is changed till it conveniently matches what we wish it said. Yeah, that is an excellent chapter in there. Highly recommend that.
Yeah,
very well done.
I've even had Rabbi Tovia Singer come on, and he's all over the Hebrew Bible, but he comes in and he's like, they're plucking so much to give it its own spin.
Yes.
It's obvious. He's an Orthodox Jew, and he's like, this is really obvious stuff.
Yes.
And a lot of the critical scholars who aren't even religious at all, they draw the same conclusions about the New Testament. It's apparently clear. So I think cognitive dissonance and the combination of magical thinking is really playing a significant role. So here's the question I have. We're bouncing between Jesus and Paul now. We've opened both doors. Both portals are there, right? And Jesus, if we were to imagine there was a historical person, he's highly magical in his thinking, but he's a Jew. So how does that work? As far as magic and Judaism, most people who think, well, what we see in Judaism doesn't seem so hocus pocus like you're talking about. How do we address that?
There's a lot of magic in the Old Testament. There are tons of magic. Saul going to the witch, the seer of Endor, and she calls up Samuel from the dead, except she's the only one who can see Samuel, oddly enough. And Saul doesn't realize it's Samuel until the witch tells him, yeah, the way he's dressed. He's up, yep, that's Samuel. Jacob in Genesis, how does he get these spotted sheep? He puts spotted branches where they come to drink water.
Yeah, I just, me, I'm like,
Yeah. And so then when they reproduce, of course, the spots from the branches show up on the lambs and so on and so on. I mean, dozens and dozens of these things. The rod of Moses, turns into a serpent, and then the Egyptian priests turn their rods into serpents, and then the big serpent that Moses has eats the other serpents, and so on and so on. Yeah, this whole thing is just, it's riddled with this kind of stuff. And you read the history, such as it is in this Old Testament, and you find that some Hebrew kings had to actually exterminate part of the population. I think it was Josiah that burned the bones of these priests on their own altars, to cleanse the nation, because you had people sacrificing their children, which is a Phoenician thing. They've actually found this thing, these precincts or whatever they call a Topheth in North Africa around Carthage, where people brought their child and sacrificed the child in these special, altars and what have you. So yeah, this was a common thing all over the Middle East. As horrifying as that sounds, and of course everybody is probably familiar with Baal, my favorite vegetation god, receiving sacrificed children and what have you. It's yeah. So yeah, this whole thing has been a question of magic deeply embedded in these cultures. It's like I've said before, a biblical text is like any other text. It embeds and encodes and presumes the elements of the society and the culture. You can't just step out of it. And on the other hand, it's hard to step into it. It's very hard to get into that mindset to where you're taking it seriously. Yeah, these people really seriously believed and acted on these beliefs. As horrible as many of them were, yeah, they believed it. It's like ancient magicians, black magicians, would go to areas where gladiators had been slain or where people had been crucified, and they would harvest body parts. And we have pieces in the magical papyri where magicians are performing things in the dark of night, and they're holding up a body part that they have in their hands, and that is going to summon spirits and raise powers and what have you.
Okay, so this brings to my attention
the Eucharist.
Yes, we needed to remember that. I want to hear your thoughts on that. But before we do about this dead body parts thing, I need to mention something I found fascinating that was mentioned by Dr. Delcy Allison Jr., New Testament scholar. He's been reading Greek since the 70s. I mean, he's a really sharp theological and historian when it comes to biblical studies. He also draws a conclusion, and he openly says his bias from his experience. He's had a subjective experience as a young man, and he says that paints his view in how he concludes, right? So he's a believer, a universalist, nonetheless. Happy ending for everybody,
Right.
But he is a believer. And I said, all right, I need you for a moment, Dr. Allison, because you have a skeptic in you, a believer in you. He says in his book, he has like 4 different versions of himself. And I said, okay, he's just like, sometimes I'm this, sometimes I'm that. I said, Dr. Allison, I need you to put on your skeptical cap. Imagine that this is historical, but Jesus didn't rise from the dead. All right. He was placed in a tomb or buried somewhere. Okay. What happened to his body? Like tell us what you think would have happened if you're a skeptic and you had the narrative we have in front of us. What do you think best suits the whole narrative? He says, well, I think that magical cult members stole the body and used the body in ritualistic black magic types, necromancy. Okay. And I'm like, listening to this, I'm dumbfounded as a skeptic going, why would I believe that? Like, holy moly. Like, but if that is the case, that is a possibility, his body would have been taken and used in magical practices. Can you imagine? I know this sounds ironic and kind of funny, but can you imagine people are worshiping a man claiming to be God? If that were the case, that his body was taken by magicians and used in a necromancy practice at night, and they're worshiping. Can you imagine if that's true? Now,
well, there are actually, as far as I know, several Bible scholars who have at least offered that as one of the possibilities of why the tomb was empty. And I mean, if you read through the magical papyri, it's kind of mind blowing, and you can get it in translation and just read it, and it's like, on one level, it's kind of a hoot. It's like, what? And on the other level, you're going like, wow, okay. Yeah. If you can believe this, you could believe pretty much anything.
Yep. That's wild.
Yeah. But, I've said this many times. Nothing prepares a person for a life of delusion better than a childhood spent in Sunday school. It scrambles logic. It scrambles the canon of evidence so that you can just go through life believing what you believe, and nobody can talk you down out of that tree. And it just is what it is. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, look, everybody, hit the like button. We have almost 400 people watching, and this is really awesome. I hope you all are, you've got your cracker, your bread, and your wine ready, because we're all going to be jumping into some magic here soon. And thank you, Trude Hell. He says, isn't eating Christ's body and drinking his blood a magic rite? Yes, it is.
Oh, yeah.
We might as well go there. Let's do it. Halloween's around the corner. And we're all going to hell anyway. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. So we'll see you there. It'll be fun.
Yeah. No, but
great company.
What's up with the Eucharist? What's going on? Because I've been told other scholars, such as I'll use Richard Carrier and even historicists, who come down and recognize mystery cult practices in this Hellenistic Judaism we call Christianity. There's magic. There's this mystery cult stuff. They're ingesting the divine. They're eating the flesh and the blood of the God. And this is early in Christian practice, because Paul talks about this in Corinthians, which means if there was a guy 2 decades ago, they've already completely dogmatized a very weird ritual of ingesting this, having this Eucharist. And it isn't just Passover. One can argue that maybe Mark and maybe Matthew are like, and maybe even Luke is like a Passover kind of replacement. But John is explicit, chew my flesh in the Greek.
Yes.
And drink my blood. So tell us about it.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that an Orthodox practicing Jew, ask anyone, could not say, eat my flesh, drink my blood.
Right.
Because Judaism, that's what, you drain the blood out of animals. You don't eat blood. And one of the things that the Jerusalem church made it in that deal we were talking about with Gentiles is that they abstain from blood.
Mm-hmm.
And we have one sect, at least, the Jehovah's Witnesses, who take that so literally, they don't even accept blood transfusions. So, the idea that Jesus, the guy who said not a single dot or tittle of the law will pass away, blah, 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 blah. You must keep the law better than the Pharisees, which was pretty high bar, because they just spent their life keeping the law. He can't say that, that's not possible rationally to come
Yeah.
out of Jesus' mouth. But the church fathers absolutely believe that is literally true.
Right.
Ignatius, who wrote about the time Revelation was written, probably about the beginning of the 2nd century, about 7 or 8 of his letters are still extant, at least in part. And he called the Eucharist the pharmakon, which basically means the potion of immortality. Obviously, that's where we get pharmacy in English. But back at that time, it wasn't pharmacy, it was magic. So you were mixing potions. And Ignatius calls the Eucharist the potion of immortality, that we not die. It's like, wow. And he actually believed that if you kept eating the Eucharist, that's what made you immortal,
Mm.
apparently, if you take him at his word. And then during the Middle Ages, the church actually had to monitor the elements of the Eucharist to keep people from walking out with them and using them in magic. They because they're powerful.
Yeah.
They're relics. And the Catholic teaching, as far as I'm aware, is still that transubstantiation literally changes the wine into blood and literally changes that wafer into flesh, even though Catholic theologians in the Middle Ages, like Thomas Aquinas, if I remember correctly, said, well, the sight and smell and texture, those are accidents. It really is flesh and blood. It just doesn't have those accidents.
Have
Which,
you heard
hey,
of the
is as
book?
good as it's as good an explanation as any, I suppose.
Have you heard of the book The Immortality Key by
Uh,
Brian C. Madarescu?
no.
He wrote a
Mm-mm.
book on this, The Immortality Key, where he believes that psychedelic, if you will, it was involved, that there was definitely taking of these chemical compounds that were ingested in these rituals.
Yeah.
As far back as you can go into ancient Egypt's mysteries and stuff, like maybe even
Yes.
the ancient Sumeria, and they were taking things and they were doing what people who have mental health issues experience with the ingestion of them. Like I've
Yes.
had
Yeah.
hallucinogens in my life, and it is an experience that you can't really. It's difficult to describe or even explain, and try to give that to someone who doesn't know would be impossible. But
Yeah.
he thinks that the early Christian cult, and he thinks he can tie it in with some of the local movements in like Ephesus and stuff,
Yeah.
where these mystery cults were ingesting these psychedelics, and they believe, he has a saying like, the ancients believed, if you die before you die, then you'll never die.
Yes. Right.
And this
Yes.
idea of death, right? Like
Right.
death before death, if you go ahead and experience death now, you'll never die. And I think
Like,
it's
yeah.
weird. It makes me kind of wonder, is there something to that? A lot of the scholars I talk to, Dennis McDonald's interested in probing deeper into this with Brian, but also other ones are like, I just don't have any concrete evidence to know that they were doing that in their early Christian days.
Hmm.
But I'm open minded. I wouldn't be dogmatist about it, because you could do that with wine, or even just people who have mental health issues already could
Right.
not eat. If you fast and you don't go to sleep for days, you're going to see stuff.
Right.
You're going to
Yeah.
experience
Yeah.
things. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's any number of possibilities out there. That's part of the problem. Actually, that's 90% of the problem about reconstructing Christian origins, is that there is so little evidence to go on. The kind of stuff that Christians might have been doing would leave no archaeological trace. If you're using biological stuff, it deteriorates, it's gone. Um, and and if you think about the ancient world generally, there's just these enormous gaps in our evidence. Alexander the Great, nobody doubts he lived, right? but no one knows where he's buried, which is kind of weird, you
Yeah,
would
for someone
think.
that big. Yeah.
Yeah, a figure like that, you would think, oh yeah, we would know pretty certainly where he's buried. I mean, we know where Hadrian was buried, for example. Um, but it just, and given the sparsity of that evidence and the very fragmentary amount of evidence for early Christianity that there is, which is all textual, okay? It's basically the New Testament. That's what we have, and that's all we have. Any number of speculations could be advanced based on the greater, wider Hebrew and Greco-Roman culture. I mean, you could have a field day, and people have. I mean, you go into the New Testament, and it's a well-known scandal of New Testament studies that people keep finding what they're looking for. And they do it, and they do, it's just predictable that
Jesus was a feminist, and
yeah, right, yeah, he was a social warrior, and or he was a magician, or he
Jesus was
was
a rebel leader. Jesus
yeah,
was an
exactly,
apocalyptic prophet. Jesus was a
yes,
magician. Jesus was
yeah,
now all of these elements. There may be some arguments there to maybe say there's something to this, but
yeah.
could he have been an apocalyptic preacher? Can you combine that and still be the magician Jesus?
Oh
I see
yeah,
no. Okay.
yes. Oh yeah, absolutely. Because if you're making the rounds of an illiterate countryside, what are your bona fides? How do you what are your credentials? Because a lot of this thing that we have today is credentialism. So we have some guy who's got a PhD in theology, which might as well, to put it bluntly, might as well be a PhD in the fairy folk or something. I mean, it's sky fairies and Bronze Age stories, and I've got a doctor in it and a doctorate, and you have people still slaving away on dissertations about the most bizarre, arcane details of the Bible and the New Testament. For what? I mean, to get a PhD, obviously, but then, I mean, what do you know as a result of it?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I kind of got to that point where I studied the biblical languages and what have you, so I could read the text. But that's kind of like you set off to climb Everest, and then you get to base camp and find out that Everest is actually just a mirage. There isn't actually any Everest there. The basic language skills get you to that point where you're ready to start climbing, and then you discover there's nothing to climb. Or as I've said, the clothes have no emperor. Now it's all whatever you want to make of it, which is getting us back to this thing about the lack of evidence means that you can go in there and you can find anything as evidence if there's no real
Yeah. No
there
concrete.
are no canons of proof here. So
Right.
you can advance anything that Jesus was a complete myth, that he came from outer space or something, that he was a hallucination of the Apostle Paul, and then Paul's hallucinatory experiences got a back formation into the Gospels to historicize it with it and dress it up with all the other, beliefs and folklore that were common in the time. And could that have been the case?
It
Yeah,
could have. Yeah, it could have.
yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, I lean the other way, but either way, yeah,
Yeah,
it's very possible.
and that's the problem. There's no way to prove or disprove conclusively any of this stuff. You just have to take what's given to you, and
Yeah.
what's given to you is a set of documents. I mean, the New Testament by word count is probably not any longer than Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Okay, uh, and how many libraries of books have been written about that?
Yeah.
that set of
And
documents.
they're going to continue. There's too many
Yes.
scholars, even in the study of New Testament. There's just so many. I have a friend I just recently interviewed, Sean W. Anthony, on. He's an Islamic scholar. He said the reason he didn't go to the New Testament is because he saw the field is loaded with people, but also he was hoping to find something shocking about Quranic manuscripts and whatnot. And as he researched it, he figured out real quickly. He was like, no, they have a pretty fixed canon, and I think this is my own little insert. I think they learned a trick or two from the Jews and the Christians.
Yes.
And said, look, we don't need to wait 200 years to figure out what's scripture and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
Let's have a standardized,
Exactly.
empire wide. Let's get fixed. Burn the other shit. Like, make sure we have it under control. And they did, and they've done a good job, pretty much, of keeping it. But you can accept that and still ontologically find issues and not have to.
Oh yeah.
So I did want to mention this whole idea of Paul and him hallucinating. 1 Corinthians 15 has this tell that it wasn't just him. That there were 12. He appeared to the apostles. He appeared to this.
Yeah.
Robert Price thinks that this is an interpolation into an interpolation. Most scholars think this is authentically Paul. If we grant this is authentically Paul and he's making this claim, are you thinking he's lying by saying they also had visionary experiences? Or do you think all of these different individuals he's adding on to this little resume that he's giving to the Corinthian church, and he's trying to like validate? And last of all, I'm included in this group. Do you think that this is? What do you think happened?
I think that if that's actually Paul, that those were visionary experiences. He talks about 500 brothers at one time. He doesn't mention anything about the women.
Yeah.
He doesn't mention anything about the empty tomb.
Right.
He doesn't seem to know or care anything about that. So if he believed in the resurrection, then as 1 Corinthians 15 says, it's sown a mortal body, it's raised a spirit body. So Paul may have, he obviously believed Jesus rose from the dead, but he may not have believed at all in a bodily resurrection. And so none of that bodily evidence, none of the tomb, none of that mattered to him at all, because that was never the point. That's not what resurrection consisted of, in that understanding. On the other hand, I very much like the idea of Dr. Price looking at that and thinking this could very well be the interpolation of a later Christian doxology or liturgy, because it goes that he was crucified, that he was raised from the dead, that this. That sounds like a doxology. It sounds like what I think it's in 1 Timothy, that he was seen, and raised and blah, blah, blah. And it has this formulaic standard kind of format of what you would think of as a ritual hymn, perhaps a recitation of faith, a confession of faith. And I think that the jury will never be in, because we cannot know.
Right.
But there are other scholars who have identified what they think are other interpolations in 1 Corinthians. I can't remember the name of the person, but he was writing at one point in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly, and he claimed to have identified about 7 points which involve interpolation. So some copyist at some point says, wow, Paul would have said this if he had just thought about it. Wouldn't it be cool if Paul had said this? Yeah, of course it would. I'll just copy it in here. Yeah, because that's tempting.
Yeah. And that's what I think has happened. Yeah. We've seen that over and over. That's a really well put point. So these other people, I guess the question then would become, if it was authentic, 2 things. What do they think? And Paul's so crazy. They also are seeing crap. So Paul must have been even weirder than them or something. Because it's in the milieu. They're people having experiences and magic and all that. The second thing is, after reading Del C. Allison's book on the resurrection, he takes a conclusion. Ultimately, at the end of the day, he believes that Jesus rose, right? But in his book, he doesn't write like that. You'd be shocked at how skeptical he is about stuff. Mm-hmm. And sometimes he's very conservative, sometimes he's very skeptical. But where he became very conservative to me was when he says, Paul doesn't mention Mary because he's androcentric, and the early church is androcentric. For those who don't know what that is, it simply means they are all about the guy. It's a patriarchal system.
Right.
They aren't really concerned about females. They're like, it's all about boys. And they're not really worried about what girls did because they don't really play a significant role in the movement, according to these authors. But then he had this, what I thought was kind of a convoluted apologist argument, where the apologist will say, well, Mark wouldn't have mentioned Mary if it wasn't really true, because that's an embarrassing argument. But to me, it's like, Paul didn't. I mean, this is his argument. To me, it's a little convoluted because Paul doesn't mention anything. He comes before Mark. He comes before these other gospels. He doesn't mention Mary coming to the tomb. Mark and Matthew, and of course, these gospels have the women coming to the tomb. Sounds more like a literary trope. And you said something interesting before we hit record. You said, and you're like, no one saw him. And I'm like, hold on, but I thought Mary was the first one who came and saw Jesus. No. You go to Mark, and she walks up. There's already a missing body. He's not even there. And there's a man, a gardener, who's like, hey, go to Galilee where you'll see Jesus. Sounds very literary. But the point is, if there is a colonel there, like, there's no body. They don't, like, the body's missing. And of course, that leaves the big question mark that we have no proof of being able to do one way or the other. So when I tell Christians, your confidence in this is really based on your subjective experience. I don't see any reason why you should have that much confidence in this unless you yourself are having apparitions, right? Based on your book. I mean, seriously, you should be getting this book. That's for sure. 375 people watching right now. Seriously, Apparitions of Jesus. Robert Connor wrote The Resurrection as Ghost Story. Did you want to comment on that? And then I wanted to circle back to ghost stories in Rome, just to touch base on that, since Halloween's right around the corner, to give us a little background on what's going on there.
Yeah, well, in Apparitions of Jesus, and this is the cover, can't get it in the camera. I dig into that quite a bit. I get into the idea that Jesus, the empty tomb. In Mark, the women flee from the tomb and they tell nobody. And then, of course, Matthew and Luke come along and say, well, that ain't going to fly. They have to tell somebody. So in Matthew, they tell somebody. Then in Luke, an interesting thing about the Road to Emmaus story is that as Jesus is walking along and he's expounding the scriptures about the Messiah and blah, 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 one of the characters says, well, these women, they came and they told us all this, and we just thought they were nuts. It's like, And yet, but to circle back to that point you made about women in the early church, Paul has a lot of things to say about women. Not in Timothy, First Timothy and Second Timothy, because Paul didn't write those books.
Right.
But he talks about our sister Phoebe. He talks about Junia, who is numbered among the apostles, whatever that means, whether esteemed or what that means, we don't know. But he talks about women more or less on par with men. So that might kind of lend some credence to the idea that whole thing in 1 Corinthians 15 is really something that has snuck into the text later.
Wow.
And the 500 brothers, okay, the Gospels are written later and nobody mentions the 500 brothers.
That's exactly what Price said. Yep.
Yeah, how weird is that? Now, Matthew has all of these people who rise from the dead in their tombs when Jesus is crucified, but they don't come out of the tombs until Sunday, at which point they leave the tombs. They've been in there for like 48 hours playing cards, drinking. I don't know what they were doing. Probably don't even want to know. And they walk into the city and they're seen by a lot of people and nobody mentions it other than Matthew. No historians, say, gee, you would believe it? I mean, the historians collected what they called paradoxa. They were fantastic stories. about people who lived extraordinarily long lives, ghost stories, what have you, anything that was curious, they actually collected it and put it into, volumes. Um, and they missed that one about all these dead people coming into the city and they were seen, and it just didn't make any sense, a lot of it. But yeah, it gets very convoluted and very long, but I delve into that in Apparitions, and at the end of the book there is about 20 some odd pages of references, so that anybody who wants more information can go back to those references and read the whole thing.
Wow.
So anyway, we were circling back to something, and
ghosts. So
Ghosts,
ghost
yes.
stories, Dr. Price also talks about not just these. I'd like to hear your thoughts on ghost stories, but I wanted to mention there were novels, if you will, or these little like tales of a loved one who dies and gets buried in a tomb.
Yeah.
And they go and the man goes to visit the tomb, and the tomb's open or something, and she's missing, and then they're like, what happened, or something like this.
Yeah, it gets better than that. It's even better than that. So here's the creepy part. You're talking about Philinian. So his background in the Greco-Roman world, people who died before they could marry and raise children were thought to become ghosts. And the Greeks actually believed that what we would call crib death today, sudden infant death syndrome,
right,
was actually caused by the ghosts of women who had died childless and were angry about it. And that's even picked up. If you remember that movie and that book, The Woman in Black.
Yes.
Yeah, that's actually, that picks up on that exact storyline. A woman who has lost her children and then becomes a vengeful ghost who is out to kill other people's children in revenge. And there's a very common figure called La Llorona in Hispanic culture. It's the same thing, a woman who has lost her children and becomes a vengeful ghost.
It reminds me of Solomon's case where he was going to split this child in half. It just, all it does is it shows you how women would be about that child or about a child. So yeah, I could see a easy myth or a lore of some ghost tale explaining SIDS.
So if the woman died before having children, then she became a restless spirit. So in this story, which is recorded by Phlegon of Tralles, who was actually the Emperor Hadrian's collector of weird things, the Philinian dies and she's buried. And then eventually a young man called Machates comes to visit her parents. And Philinian shows up in his bedroom for a couple of nights, and they're getting it on. And everything is going smoothly until one of the maids happens to overhear them and looks in the room and goes, "Oh my God, it's Philinian," and tells the parents. Then the parents come in, and the mother's going like, "What?" And Philinian then dies again. And so this causes a big stir, and the city officials go to open the tomb. And when they open the tomb, Philinian's not there, but what is there are these little trinkets that Machates has gifted her as little tokens of affection. They're in her tomb. And she's gone. So she's kind of vampiric in that way. That she rises at night, and then and then poof, she's gone. And that's the other there's an interesting parallel there of leaving tokens in the tomb. Do we have something like that in the New Testament? Yeah, actually, Peter runs to the tomb, and what does he find? The binding claws of Jesus. These binding, the cloth that's been bound to prepare Jesus for burial, are all folded up and laying in the tomb. And Jesus is gone. It's like, oh, tokens left in the tomb. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense now.
Wow.
And it's kind of a shame that we don't have more ghost stories, because they're tremendously entertaining. There's another one about a guy who dies, and then his son is born after he dies, and it turns out the child is a hermaphrodite, which is bad juju in the Greco-Roman world. Yeah, it's like a two-headed calf or something like that. No, that's bad luck. He comes back from the dead, and he eats the child, except for the head. And then the head prophesies. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, man.
I don't make the news. I just report it.
No, I get it. I'm not shooting the reporter. That is wow. Okay.
Yeah.
There's so many things that you talk about. You mentioned, I mean, we went over everything. We went over a lot of different things briefly. I'm sure we could do a deeper dive. But I've just been fascinated by this whole magic thing because I don't even think Christians, I really don't think this, because I was a Christian for so long that I just didn't think this way myself, would understand what that even means by magical. Like in our minds, we would think, I pray, there's power when I pray, according to me, like I think that there's power and God's listening. And it's not, I don't think we're thinking like you're talking about it, the way that they're superstitious on that level. Like, don't look in a mirror while there's thunderstorms, or like the mirror might suck your soul, like weird stuff like that. There are people who think that.
Yeah.
But that seems to be the level of type of superstition on everything around them, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, well, and also, as somebody said, religion is what we thought before we understood mental illness. So, wow. I mean, and it's like you were talking about the people who go and they talk in tongues and roll on the floor and do all this, have seizures, and then they go to Arby's or something, and they appear to be perfectly normal. It's, they're not stark raving mad in every facet of their life.
Right.
But on one level, they're functionally insane.
Right.
They're just not processing reality. They're creating their own parallel reality. And I don't know. I don't know the answer to all that. I think but as we kind of mentioned before, this is not a no-go area anymore for psychologists. And they're beginning to look at what they call psychotheology, which is an interesting term, because I think a lot of theology is kind of psycho, but yeah. But they're looking at seizure activity about people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, people who have what basically are minor seizures, but they don't have any kind of overt physical manifestation. They don't twitch, they don't fall down, they don't foam at the mouth, whatever, they don't lose consciousness. But it is kind of interesting that people, like I said before, for thousands and thousands of years, they have these experiences of ghosts. And there have been studies done on people who were recently bereaved, and they vary from just the feeling of a presence. I feel like my ex-wife is here with me. Some people, a very small percentage of them, see their ex-wife.
Right.
Yeah, they hear them. They feel like they're there. That's part of the way that it's part of the way that we're built in to think of things culturally. When you talk to somebody, you don't think you're talking to just an animated piece of meat. You think that there's a person inside them.
Right.
You think that they have a mind, and we tend to exteriorize that mind and think that mind goes on.
Yeah, the mind goes on, the rest
is
done.
Yeah,
this is a great point. There's so much there that you're talking about that's tapping into the science I'm looking into about why I'm a naturalist. Why I'm, even like, what is consciousness, right? People get it and they start to do this thing with it and stuff.
Yeah.
And I get why. Naturally, I understand why. But I mean, I'm more like, I'm reductionist. I'm more of a rationalist in my thinking and trying to say, okay, hold on. is it a product of the brain? And so,
Yeah.
this is really interesting territory where we don't have all the answers on it, but we're still investigating this. It just seems like that's the angle in which, for me, seems like the evidence, and I've been looking at a scope of different things at the moment. It seems like that's the way it's aiming. I just
Yes,
don't
it
see
is.
any.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is slowly. It's slowly going there. And as some of these barriers to talking about religion come down, then you have a more honest and a wider conversation, so that you can look at the letters of Paul and you can ask yourself honestly, if this guy was here today, would he be in a padded cell? Would anybody be taking him seriously except, a handful of evangelicals probably, who will listen to anything and believe anything, and as we know, or would he be dismissed out of hand and say, okay, yeah, we're going to get you a psych evaluation and we'll see where we go from there.
Today,
Yes, exactly. That's how we would deal with it today. But that was not an option at the time, because the broader culture believed that these were doors of perception that were opening, like the doors, and that psychotropic substances really were a gateway into a deeper reality.
Right.
Or a spirit quest, if you want to call it that, or whatever. It exists across all these cultures for a reason. There's something built in to the human psyche that just simply evolves into this feeling of there's something else out there. And
it's an interesting topic. Everything we talked about was amazing. I really want, before we go, I want this guy Otangelo named Joe Blogs. I have a very hard time believing that this guy's name is Joe Blogs. He seems to fit the category of the people we were talking about earlier, where they just don't. They got to get it off their. He's working out his spiritual muscles right now. He's talking about the Shroud of Turin in the chat.
Oh my God!
Why would people die for what they believe if it was a lie? And it's the same thing. You kind of got to go. Do you get tired of hearing that? You got to ask. You kind of wonder, like, do you go to sleep at night? Go, Pinky and the Brain, the cartoon back in the day, is like, tomorrow, what are we going to do? We'll try to take over the atheist world again. Like, it's the same thing every day. And you never take over the world with it. You just keep doing it. Yeah. Anyway,
before we get away, I would mention another book that is not about religion at all specifically. Yeah. It's called The Basic Laws of Human Stupidity. It's by an economist. He's deceased now. He was teaching at UC Berkeley, I believe. His last name is Chipola. The Basic Laws of Human Stupidity is a little thin book. You can get it on Amazon. It'll cost you, buy it used for probably $1.50. But he, from an economist standpoint, looks at the question of why are there so many educated, stupid people? and it's fascinating, because you think, oh, this guy is going to be a send-up. He's just going to be blowing smoke. Yeah. But this is actually an analytical book. You can read it in a question of 2 or 3 hours. He's got 7 laws in there. And believe me, you read it, you will go, yeah, actually, yes, I've seen that. Why you have got PhDs in biology coming out and saying, oh yeah, take the horse paste for the virus. Sure. Take something that's designed to kill worms, but take it for a virus, because what's the difference between worms and viruses? Who knows? And why the culture is just eaten alive with nonsense of all kinds coming from everywhere. How can people who are educated, supposedly accomplished individuals, believe stuff that is just like whacked? Yeah. And The Basic Laws of Human Stupidity. Buy it, read it. It is an eye opener.
Yeah. So Joe blogs, I think it's detrimental that you might read this, which I know Joe's Otangelo, just so everybody knows.
Uh-huh.
It's gotta be. It's gotta be. It's gotta be the same guy. If not, it's his twin brother. Seriously. He's asking us to explain the Shroud of Turin, and it's like, this is the same thing he does every single time. It's the same.
Yeah.
So what I'll probably do is get some people who've done extensive research at some point on the Shroud, and actually have them come, and then Satisfactory will just reference that same PhD who's already looked through this and seen the problems. And then,
during the Middle Ages, there were, as I recall, there were 7 different cathedrals in Europe that had Jesus' foreskin.
Really?
So you don't need no shroud. Okay.
Did they kiss it?
I TMI, dude. TMI. Yeah, because that was the one thing that Jesus didn't take with him when he ascended to heaven, apparently. And and they collected that as a relic, and it was in 7 different places at the same time, which was a hell of a foreskin. I mean, wow. Yeah. So when it comes to relics, basically, no, there are no rules. There are no guardrails. People will believe anything.
That is so true. Yeah, there's so many things. Just ask questions. Just be more critical. Don't just start with your, like I said earlier this morning, I was interviewed by someone else. Don't start with your holy cows, if you will. Here is my sacred cow, and I'm going to do everything I can to protect my sacred cow, to keep my faith. Take jabs, like poke holes,
But here's a question. Here's a simple question. Okay. What about apparitions of Mary? If you're a fundamentalist Baptist pastor and you believe all this stuff because people, quote, saw it, then how about the thousands of people who have seen apparitions of the Virgin Mary? Extremely well documented.
Yeah.
I mean, there are countries like Ireland that actually have tours where you can go around and you can stop at all the different places where Mary has appeared to somebody. Okay, so if eyewitness stuff is what you're looking for, that's been validated over and over again, then it's definitely Mary, the Mother of God, has appeared to all these people. And so you might as well just suck it up and become a Catholic, or at least incorporate that into your belief.
Yeah, they can. You know how it goes.
Yeah.
That's a demon for them. That's not even really Mary or whatever. There's always something. But even the Catholic Church has taken a stance against some of these things. And they're like, yeah, all right, guys, there's enough of this.
Yeah.
You're doing it too much. There's some, it seems like they've taken kind of like, we don't think those were authentic. We think these ones are.
Oh, they're losing it. The Pope even thinks vaccines work. What does he know? Come on.
You're crazy.
I prefer Gonzo, but crazy will work.
Look, I want everybody to go get the book, Apparitions of Jesus, the Resurrection as Ghost Story. I highly recommend everybody to get a better grasp on maybe what Paul was actually thinking. I'll try and post it in the chat. Let me get the link. Well, I've got it down in the description of this video, but I'm going to copy it and paste it here so everybody can check it out. Oh, wow. That's a long link. Okay. Bear with me. That link is longer than I thought. And yeah, so please check that out. Let me know what you guys think of the book. I really want you to check that out. Thanks for mentioning the difference between a worm and a virus. Stupidity is rampant here. Serious. Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate everybody. Thank Otangelo for showing up in the chat once again. That never ends. And there's almost 400 people in here. Please like the video. Consider joining the Patreon. I drop new videos every day. Just about. I mean, I'm working hard. Always dropping new content. This one I just launched yesterday, public. This is a hallucination theory. So this goes into the vein of what we just discussed today. Dale C. Allison Jr. and I were talking, of course, and a question was from Paulogia. So for those of you who are on the YouTube world who know Paulogia, these were his questions posed to scholar Dr. Delcy Allison Jr. about hallucination, his hallucination theory. And I'm sure that some of this content is going to end up on his channel. We were talking before I made my trip to Princeton University to go interview him. Paul's silence about Jesus, resurrection and the parousia. We know that failed. The return failed.
Mm-hmm.
Cognitive dissonance set in. Joseph of Arimathea. These are all Dale Allison ones. And then Robert Price. And there's Dale right there. Dale right there. I've just been working my butt away, literally. So if you guys are wanting to check all this out, help support and steer the direction of the show, be sure to join the Patreon. You guys can help out in that way. And then I got to ask you, as we leave, we've been talking about demons and ghosts and hallucinations and visions and magic and all of this stuff. Is there anything you'd want to wrap the show up with? Anything at all, and then we can always pick up again. I want to have you back because I want to go deeper into this after I've read some of your work.
Well, you mentioned Dale Allison, who I have a great respect for. Dale Allison actually, in a book on the resurrection, compared the Road to Emmaus appearance of Jesus to phantom hitchhikers.
Oh, wow.
to the urban legend of the phantom hitchhiker, because you pick them up and only when you recognize that they're a ghost do they disappear. It's like, yeah. So I think that's as close as he came to calling the Road to Emmaus thing a ghost story. But that's pretty close.
That is, especially for someone who is a believer.
Yeah.
So I think believers take some notes from a scholar who concludes, the Christian faith and realizes that, some of this stuff is literary and doesn't buy it as literally true. And I really do appreciate him. He's very sophisticated. He pays attention a lot to detail. And I really like him as a person too, hanging out with him in person. Otangelo, look, if you want to steer the direction of the show, you got the cart in front of the horse here, my friend. You got to join the Patreon, and then you can ask questions, and then I can do, you know what I'm saying? So that's how that works, man. It doesn't work the other way around.
That's funny.
Yeah,
that's funny.
I'm fairly certain he won't. I know Christians who said they're like, look, I liked this episode. I don't like these 5 that you did, but I like this one.
Right.
Sometimes I'll do stuff and it's not as confrontational as this, but they're like, I can't give money to someone who's an atheist. Like,
I know. Yeah. Yeah.
They're like, I can't give money to you. And I'm like,
yeah.
Do you pay the lawn guy? What if he doesn't believe? Like, do you pay the electrician company? What if the owner of that company is a Buddhist or that person is an atheist or something? Like, at the end of the day, what I'm saying is what I do at MythVision, and if you join the Patreon, it is my labors that you're actually paying for because I do a lot of hard work.
Well,
it's not a tithing type. I work very hard to do what I do.
I would ask them, are you sure you've never contributed money to a child molester?
You don't know that.
Can you know that for sure?
There's a high statistic rating there. If you visited a church at some point, you probably have.
You might have.
Yeah.
Yeah. On that cheery note.
Well, look, ladies and gentlemen, hit the like button again. I really enjoy this. I've wanted to do an interview with you for over a year now, and every time it got to it, something else distracted me. I mean, I'm one guy. Like, I'll do a show on literally right now. I'll give you an example as we're leaving here. I'll do a show on Islam, right? And the immediate comments on the video are, dude, why aren't you investigating Hinduism? And dude, why aren't you looking into Manichaeism? And why aren't you doing a thing on Buddha? And I'm like, bro, I am one guy, and trust me, I wish I could just consume all of that literature and know everything all at once and had all the scholars' emails, all the critical scholars, I wish I could do all that at once. Be patient.
Right. I'm not Ghostbusters.
Yes. Eventually, though, I will explore those territories. I will dig in, uncover these, and have academics from those regions discuss these things. But please bear with me and understand I'm on a journey. I'm one guy, and I'm doing the damnedest I can. So,
yeah. Okay. Send me a link to this when it comes up, and I'll copy it over to John Loftus because I think he would appreciate it. Gets a shout out. That's good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
David Madison and some of these other contributors, I think they would, definitely appreciate it.
I seriously swear by this. This is the book. It's got it all. It's got it all. Hey,
It's a good book.
I might as well read just to give people a tease of the content. So I'm not going to name all the people. I'm just going to name like the subtitle for the chapters. Miracles and Challenge of Apologetics. God would not perform miracles. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Properly investigating miracle claims. Assessing Keener's miracles. The abject failure of Christian apologetics. Why do Christians believe in miracles? And then part 2 goes into why the Romans believed the Gospels. How New Testament writers helped Jesus fulfill prophecy. The prophetic failure of Christ's return, which is written by you. 5 inconvenient truths that falsify biblical revelation. Properly investigating key biblical miracles. Evolution is a fact. Old Testament miracle genres as folklore and legend. Science, miracles, and Noah's flood. Jesus Christ, docetic demigod. Miracles of the Christian magicians, you again. Credulity at Cana. The resurrection of Jesus never took place, pretty blunt. John Loftus wrote that. And then yours, Paul's Christianity. And that ends the note with you at page like 540 something. It's a pretty big book.
Yeah. Yep.
Gotta get it.
I mean, if you had to, you could kill somebody with that book. You know,
that's what I always tell people. If you don't want to read it, you can use it as a weapon. Like, for real. Throw it at someone.
That's right. That's right. It's got
Absolutely.
Sharp corners.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome.
Please go get his book. Once again, gotta let you see it. It's down in the description. Apparitions of Jesus. He had to put a different kind of cover image there because I guess the other one was too much for the publisher to want to put on the book. I can't imagine what you had there. So, and don't forget, we are MythVision.